In the spring of 1973, a drainage contractor named Harold Pusey was running a backhoe along the edge of a low wetland south of Collinsville, Illinois, cutting an irrigation channel for a farm operation that had been trying to bring that bottom ground into production for the better part of a decade. The American Bottom, as the broad floodplain of the Mississippi between the river's eastern bluffs and the channel itself is called, had been worked and flooded and worked again across memory, and the ground out there carried the particular density that centuries of repeated inundation give to river soil, a weight you feel in the machine before the bucket even breaks the surface. Pusey had run equipment on this landscape for 15 years. He had a practiced sense of what different depths of silt felt like going under, and he had no expectation of anything beyond the clay hardpan he was cutting through to make the drainage functional. At a depth of approximately 18 feet, his bucket came up carrying something that was not clay, not gravel, and not any category of natural deposit that 15 years of working that ground had prepared him to recognize. The bucket was carrying a timber. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The timber was bald cypress, a wood native to the wetland margins of the Mississippi Valley, darkened to near black by the anaerobic conditions of the silt column, but structurally intact in a way that surprised every person who subsequently handled it. Along two of its faces, the cuts were squared at precise right angles, and along its upper surface ran a series of adze marks spaced at regular intervals, each one parallel to the last, the pattern of a tool drawn across green wood by someone who knew what finished structural timber was supposed to look like. It was not driftwood. It was not a log shaped by current and deposited by chance. It was a worked beam, cut and placed by human hands, sitting at a depth that put it beneath the silt record of at least 3 major documented flood events, the most recent of which, by the layering visible in the trench wall, had deposited material no earlier than the middle of the 18th century. Pusey stopped his machine and called his foreman over. The foreman looked at the beam, looked at the trench depth, and placed a call to the county extension office, which forwarded the notification to the Illinois State Museum in Springfield under the state's salvage archaeology protocol. A field archaeologist named Donna Reitman arrived from the museum's anthropology division 4 days later and spent 2 hours examining the exposure before directing Pusey to widen the excavation by 30 feet in each direction. What that widening uncovered, over the 6 days that followed, was not a single timber. It was a floor. The timbers ran in parallel courses at consistent spacing, the gaps between them filled with compacted clay aggregate that had hardened under the weight of 18 feet of silt overburden. Along the exposed northern edge of the cut, where the trench wall was most stable, a second structural element emerged, a line of upright posts, also squared, also carrying the marks of adze work, set into a prepared footing of rammed gravel that had held them vertical through whatever event had covered everything above them. The posts were placed at intervals of approximately 4 feet from center to center. That spacing is not produced by natural processes. Nothing in the flood record of the American Bottom deposits upright structural posts at 4 feet on center. Somebody placed them there deliberately, and the gravel footings they were anchored into had been prepared before the posts went in, rammed into a bed below the post base to stabilize them against the lateral movement that saturated floodplain soil produces in any vertical member not anchored to something solid beneath. Reitman's field notes from those 6 days, obtained through a records request by a regional historical journal in 1981, are careful in a way that experienced archival readers recognize as meaningful restraint. She writes that the structural remains are consistent with substantial pre-contact habitation. She writes that the depth of the deposit and the character of the overlying silt layers indicate burial by multiple successive flood events rather than a single inundation. Her third observation is the most striking: the spatial organization of the timbers, running in coordinated courses over an exposure of approximately 2,000 square feet of opened ground, implies a structure or structures of a scale not previously documented in the American Bottom region below the Cahokia site complex. And then, at the bottom of the entry for the 6th day, she notes that organic samples have been collected for radiocarbon analysis and submitted to the laboratory at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The next entry in her notebook is dated 11 days later and concerns a different site entirely. The carbon dating results are not mentioned again anywhere in her surviving field notes. That gap is not immediately remarkable. Radiocarbon results in 1973 took weeks to return, and a salvage archaeologist moving between multiple active sites in a single field season would not necessarily record laboratory outcomes in the same notebook as daily excavation notes. But the results are also absent from the formal site report Reitman filed with the museum upon completing fieldwork, a document that describes the structural remains in substantial detail, notes the sample submission, and records the site as pending further laboratory analysis before classification. That classification, the formal designation that would place the Pusey site in the official Illinois Archaeological Site Inventory and make its contents part of the public record, was never assigned. The site was logged under a provisional survey number. The trench was backfilled. The field went back into cultivation. The Illinois State Archaeological Survey maintains records of every site assigned a formal inventory designation within the state. A provisional survey number, the category under which the Pusey site was entered, does not carry the same preservation review requirements, the same public reporting obligations, or the same disclosure triggers as a full classification. It sits in a separate administrative file, reviewed on a different schedule, accessible by a different pathway of records requests. That distinction is procedural and entirely routine. It is also the mechanism by which a structure covering 2,000 square feet of worked timber and rammed gravel post footings at 18 feet below the present surface was effectively removed from the active research conversation about pre-contact occupation of the American bottom. Not by any deliberate act of concealment, but by the standard operation of a classification system that nobody had designed to accommodate a discovery at that depth. Reitman left the Illinois State Museum in 1976. Her subsequent publication record shows no further work on the American bottom, on deep floodplain occupation sequences, or on any material touching what she spent 6 days documenting 3 years earlier. A move to federal agency work and a change in research focus are ordinary professional events. What is less ordinary is that the carbon dating results she submitted to Urbana-Champaign in the autumn of 1973 do not appear in the formal site file, and the laboratory at Urbana-Champaign holds no accessible record of a result returned under the provisional designation she used, which has since been reorganized into a different administrative category. The result either was returned and filed somewhere the current system does not index by that survey number, or it was retained outside the formal record when Reitman departed, or it was never returned because the sample did not survive transit intact. All three explanations are operationally plausible. None of them explains why a radiocarbon date on a worked timber from 18 feet below a Mississippi River floodplain has never appeared in the published literature on pre-contact settlement of the American bottom, the American bottom floods. That fact shapes everything the record does and does not contain about the pre-contact occupation of this landscape. The Mississippi has inundated the floodplain repeatedly through documented history, with major events in 1844, 1903, 1943, 1947, and 1993. Each event deposited sediment. Each layer of sediment raised the current surface elevation by measurable increments and pressed whatever was beneath it deeper into the column below. The practical consequence for any structure buried before the earliest of those events is that it sits beneath a stratigraphy that the standard archaeological survey method applied to this region was never designed and has never been resourced to penetrate. Standard survey practice in the period of the Pusey site discovery relied on shovel testing at defined intervals across a survey area, supplemented by machine trenching in locations where surface indicators suggested subsurface features. Shovel testing at 18 feet is not standard procedure. It requires specific reason to believe something exists at that depth, and the American bottom presented no surface indication that anything lay below the well-documented Mississippian and woodland sequence at 3 to 6 feet. The protocol was built for the depth range where the great majority of recorded sites in the region have been found. The Pusey site was found at a depth the protocol was never designed to reach, by a machine operator whose purpose was drainage and who had no reason to stop short of the hardpan. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In 1968, a salvage crew working ahead of a highway construction project along Illinois Route 3 in Monroe County, approximately 30 miles south of the Pusey site, exposed structural remains at 16 feet below the modern surface during a bridge approach cut. The foreman, a man named Walter Shoney, filed a standard disruption notification and halted work in the affected area. A contract archaeologist named Louis Ferber, working under the Illinois Department of Transportation's salvage protocol, examined the exposure and collected wood and charcoal samples for laboratory analysis. His site report, accessible in the State Archive under a full inventory designation, describes the remains as a midden deposit of considerable depth containing faunal material, ceramic sherds, and charred structural wood. The radiocarbon dates on those samples are listed as pending at the time of filing. A supplementary report was to follow with the laboratory results. No supplementary report appears in that file. The ceramic sherds described in Ferber's report were transferred to a state museum storage facility and catalogued under the Monroe County Site designation. A records request filed in 1989 by a graduate student at Southern Illinois University confirmed that the material is present and catalogued. The catalogue entry describes the sherds as consistent with late woodland period ceramic production. The student was attempting to determine whether any material from the Monroe County site shared stylistic characteristics with the structural remains Reitman had documented at the Pusey site at roughly the same stratigraphic depth, 16 miles to the north. The comparison would have required radiocarbon dates from both sites to anchor the ceramic sequence to a timeline. Neither date is in the accessible record. The thesis chapter containing the comparative analysis does not appear in the student's final submitted text. The student, now retired from a teaching career in Belleville, describes the chapter as removed at committee direction on the grounds that the evidentiary basis was not sufficient to support the comparison it required. A correct decision, she has said in correspondence, one she has returned to since. 2 sites, 30 miles apart, same depth range, same construction type, radiocarbon samples submitted in both cases, results absent from the public record in both. That is what the site reports contain when read against the file gaps they describe. The geometry of the Pusey site's structural remains, as documented in Reitman's field notes, belongs to a construction tradition that any student of the pre-contact built environment of the Mississippi Valley would recognize. Posts at 4 feet from center to center, set into rammed gravel footings below the post base, running in a documented line over 40 feet of exposed length with the structure continuing unexcavated in both directions, describes a building of unknown total area following engineering logic that Cahokia's own builders applied to their largest post-circle compounds and enclosed structures. The rammed gravel footings are a stabilization technique documented in the construction sequences of Cahokia's platform mound architecture, not in the archaeological record of seasonal encampments or in permanent use. They are a feature of buildings built to stand through saturated ground and repeated freeze-thaw cycles, set by people who had learned from structural failure what duration required. The worked floor, extending over 2,000 square feet of coordinated timber courses, is not the scale of a family encampment. It implies a community with the organization and the labor to prepare a surface of that area and cover it. Bald cypress, the species Pusey's bucket first lifted from the ground, grows in standing water and wetland margins. It does not grow on the upland prairie to the east of the bluffs, or on the higher ground above the floodplain. Dressed bald cypress at a construction site in the American bottom means organized access to timber from the river's wetland margins, transported to the site, and worked before placement. That is not the logistical signature of a temporary camp. It is the signature of a community with enough labor to sustain a supply line of that kind and enough expectation of remaining in place to make the investment worth making. The silt column above those footings, in the section of trench wall where the stratigraphy was most legible, showed the layered signature of 4 distinct flood events between the structural surface and modern grade. The topmost layer, immediately below plough depth, was consistent with material deposited during or after the 1844 Mississippi flood. The 3 layers below it descended in sequence, each separated from the next by a zone of alluvial reworking that stratigraphers read as the signature of a dry interval between events. The structural surface was buried by a flood that preceded 1844 by a margin Reitman describes in her own notes as considerable. In the professional vocabulary of stratigraphy, applied to a silt column with 4 flood layers above a built surface, that word has a specific and narrow range. It does not mean decades, it means centuries. The 1844 flood is documented in newspaper accounts, Army Corps correspondence, and the logs of river pilots who navigated this stretch of the Mississippi in its aftermath. It deposited material across the entire American bottom at measurable depth. Whatever put the Pusey site timbers in the ground preceded it. The carbon date would have placed a number on that precedence, told the record whether the structure was built a century before 1844 or 5 centuries before. The date was submitted to the laboratory in Urbana-Champaign in the autumn of 1973. It has never appeared in the published record. The bald cypress beams that Harold Pusey's backhoe first brought to the surface were removed from the trench during excavation and transferred to the Illinois State Museum in Springfield, catalogued under the provisional survey number and placed in storage. A records request confirmed the accession entry exists. The catalogue gives dimensions, a species identification as bald cypress, and condition notes. In the field where a radiocarbon date would normally appear, the entry reads, "Pending laboratory analysis." Pending, in 1973, meant a result was on its way. In 2004, when the records request was filed, it meant something that had spent 31 years without anyone actively expecting it. The beams are in storage in Springfield. The gravel footings are in a field south of Collinsville. The post holes are in a field 30 miles south in Monroe County. The carbon dates from both sites are wherever they went when nobody was maintaining the file. Reitman's field notes, the 6 days of careful observation that constitute the most detailed surviving account of what the Pusey site contained, are held at a regional archive, accessible to anyone who submits the appropriate records request and knows the provisional survey number. The number is not indexed in the standard directory of Illinois archaeological sites. It appears in no publication that would give a researcher reason to search for it. It is findable only if you already know it exists. The Monroe County Site Report, filed by Louis Ferber in 1968, is in the State Archive and is accessible under its full inventory designation. The supplementary report carrying the radiocarbon results is absent from the same file. The ceramic material is in storage, catalogued, and unanalyzed in the comparative sense that would connect it to the Pusey material by depth and construction type. The thesis chapter that would have attempted that connection is not in the submitted thesis. Harold Pusey retired from contracting work in 1988 and died in Collinsville in 2001. He gave one interview about what his backhoe uncovered in the spring of 1973 to a local newspaper that ran the story on an inside page of the regional section. The piece quoted a museum spokesperson saying further study would determine the site's significance. No follow-up was ever published. Pusey told the reporter, in the only words he ever put on the record about that morning, that the timber was so solid you could have built a house on it right then. That it looked, when they first lifted it out, like it had been cut last week, that he had no idea how old anything down there was, but that whatever was down there, somebody had built it to last. Nobody has yet determined how long it was down there. That determination was made possible in the autumn of 1973, when Donna Reitman's samples arrived at a laboratory in Urbana-Champaign and a radiocarbon result was produced from a worked timber at 18 feet below the surface of the American bottom. That result has never been released. 18 feet below a field south of Collinsville, the gravel footings are still there. The timbers pulled from above them are in a storage facility in Springfield, catalogued under a provisional number with the date field reading pending. The number that field should contain may exist in a laboratory record from 50 years ago, or it may have been lost in the ordinary friction of institutional record keeping over half a century. Either way, it has not reached the public record. The floor is there. The date is not. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.